the northwest coast. A haunting family tragedy. In this haunting tale, the protagonist, James, becomes embroiled in a terrifying mystery when his old friend, Mark, contacts him late at night. Mark's aunt, a woman named Aunt Lila, who had moved to a remote region in the mountains, has returned under strange circumstances, pale, weak, and claiming her husband has disappeared. As they delve into the chilling events surrounding Aunt Lila, James uncovers unsettling supernatural occurrences, shadowy figures, strange voices, and unearthly forces plague Aunt Lila's household after a family trip to a remote mountain village. Strange entities begin to reveal themselves, leading to a terrifying confrontation with an ancient evil tied to the area. As James and Mark race to uncover the truth, they are pulled into a world of dark rituals, ghostly apparitions, and life-threatening danger. The story's tension escalates into a nerve-wracking showdown between the living and the malevolent spirits, with high emotional stakes, eerie atmosphere, and chilling discoveries. It's a journey of fear, mystery, and the terrifying power of the supernatural. Part 1. The unexpected call. James sat slouched on his couch, the soft glow of the television barely holding his attention as he scrolled absent-mindedly through his phone. The evening had dragged on, and his day had been a tiring blur of endless Zoom meetings and the monotony of working from home. The silence of the night had settled in thick and heavy, with only the occasional hum of the city breaking through the stillness. His eyes flickered to the clock. It was nearing midnight. Then his phone buzzed, breaking the silence with its sudden, jarring vibration. It wasn't a text, it wasn't a notification, it was a call. James frowned. No one called him at this hour. He glanced at the screen, the name blinking softly. Mark, his childhood friend. They hadn't spoken in months, perhaps a year. Life had pulled them apart, as it often does with childhood friendships. The call struck James as odd. His frown deepened, curiosity prickling at the back of his mind. He swiped the screen and lifted the phone to his ear. Mark. There was a pause, a strange hesitation. The kind that sets your nerves on edge before you even know why. Then, a voice shaky, uncertain. James, I'm sorry to call you so late. James straightened, the tone in Mark's voice enough to make him sit up. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Mark? What's going on? James asked, trying to keep his voice steady but feeling a creeping unease slither up his spine. Mark's breath was uneven, like he was trying to control a wave of panic. It's Aunt Lila, he said, almost whispering her name as though speaking it aloud might summon something. James froze. Aunt Lila. He hadn't heard that name in years. She had been a kind, gentle woman, always ready with a smile. She had practically raised Mark after his parents passed, and James remembered spending countless afternoons at her house when they were kids, playing in the backyard, laughing, and eating the delicious cookies she used to bake. But about 7 or 8 years ago, she had moved to the remote mountains of the northwest after marrying a man she had met there. From then on, she became a distant memory, a relic of their childhood. What about her? James asked, though the hairs on the back of his neck were already standing up, an instinctual response to Mark's trembling voice. She's back. Mark's voice broke slightly. She came back to the city yesterday, alone. James waited, sensing there was more, much more. She's not the same. Mark continued, his voice a low tremor. Her husband, he's missing. And she's... James, she's pale like death. She won't talk about what happened up there, but she looks terrified. Really terrified. James swallowed hard, feeling the unease grow into a tangible knot in his chest. And that's not all, is it? No. Mark's voice grew even quieter, almost like he didn't want to say the words out loud. We've been hearing things, footsteps at night, whispers, doors opening and closing on their own. I don't know how to explain it, but it's like something followed her back, James. Something wrong. James felt his mouth go dry. What do you mean, something followed her back? Like a person? No, it's not a person. Mark's voice was brittle now, teetering on the edge of panic. It feels dark. James, I don't know how else to say it. I need your help. I don't know what to do. The silence that followed felt oppressive, weighing down the air between them. James' mind raced. He had never believed in the supernatural, but the fear in Mark's voice was palpable. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a joke. Whatever was happening to Mark and his aunt, it was real to them. And it was terrifying. Mark's voice came through again, softer this time. Please, I don't know who else to turn to. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. All right, I'll come. Just stay with her, okay? Don't leave her alone, Mark exhaled, a sound of relief laced with residual fear. Thank you, James. Thank you. As James hung up the phone, the weight of the situation settled over him like a heavy fog. He stood up, pacing the room, trying to shake the eerie chill that had crept into his bones. What exactly had Mark meant by something following her back? And what could have happened to Aunt Lila's husband? He grabbed his jacket and keys, heading for the door. He couldn't ignore this, not with Mark sounding like he was on the verge of a breakdown. Not with Aunt Lila missing her husband and a strange darkness surrounding them both. As James stepped out into the cold night, the full moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale, ghostly light over the empty streets. The city felt strangely desolate at this hour, the world around him too still, too quiet. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally long, every corner cloaked in an unsettling gloom. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the growing sense of foreboding creeping through his veins. Mark lived about a half hour away, but the drive felt longer. The streets were empty, and the only sound was the low hum of the engine. James' mind kept replaying Mark's words, the fear in his voice, the image of Aunt Lila returning from the mountains pale, trembling, and alone. The idea of something following her back gnawed at the edges of James' rational mind, but he couldn't shake it. He turned the corner, the narrow road leading into the more suburban part of town where Mark's house sat. The trees lining the street seemed to whisper in the wind, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. James glanced at them briefly. An irrational thought creeping into his mind was something out there, watching him. He shook his head, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He was letting his imagination get the best of him. Finally, he pulled into Mark's driveway. The house stood dark and foreboding, its windows like hollow eyes staring into the night. James parked the car, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment, gathering his thoughts. The silence around him was thick, as though the night itself was holding its breath. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and walked to the front door. Before he could knock, the door swung open, and there stood Mark, disheveled, pale, and with dark circles under his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Thank God you're here," Mark said, his voice barely above whisper. He stepped aside to let James in, closing the door behind them with a soft click. The air inside the house was different, heavier, colder, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. James felt it immediately, the way the hair on his arm stood on end, the prickling sensation on the back of his neck. Something was off. It wasn't just Mark's words, it was the house itself. It felt wrong. Mark led James into the living room, where Aunt Lila was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the wall. She was even paler than James had imagined, her skin almost translucent, her eyes hollow and distant. She looked like a ghost of herself, a shell of the vibrant woman James remembered from their childhood. "Lila," James said gently as he approached, but she didn't respond. She didn't even blink. Mark hovered nervously nearby, wringing his hands. "She's been like this since she came back. Barely talks, barely moves, just sits there, staring." James knelt beside her, speaking softly. "Lila, it's James. Do you remember me?" Her eyes shifted slightly, but they didn't focus. It was like she was looking through him, not at him. James glanced up at Mark, who looked as though he was on the verge of tears. "Last night," Mark began, his voice trembling, "I heard something, a whisper." It wasn't her voice, James. It was something else coming from her room. James felt a chill snake down his spine. Mark's voice dropped to a whisper. He said, "My name, James Blood, but I'm cold." He glanced back at Lila, who hadn't moved. The stillness in the room was suffocating. "I don't know what's happening," James Mark continued, his voice cracking. "I don't know if she brought something back with her from that village, or if something happened to her husband that caused all this. But whatever it is, it's in this house now. And I'm scared." James looked at his friend, at the fear in his eyes, and knew that whatever had happened to Aunt Lila in those mountains was far from over. Something had followed her, something dark, something dangerous. And they were all trapped in its grip. As the minutes ticked by, the air in the room seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive. A shadow passed over the moon outside, casting the room in near darkness. And in that silence, James heard it a soft, barely there whisper. It wasn't Lila's voice. It was something else, something watching, waiting, and it had already claimed its place in the house. Part 2. Aunt Lila's Return. James's car crawled to a stop in front of Mark's house, the heavy weight of uncertainty pressing down on him like a vice. The night had grown darker, and the faint hum of the city behind him now felt distant, as if he were crossing into another realm altogether. The street was eerie quiet, the kind of silence that held its breath, as if anticipating something terrible. He stepped out of the car, taking a deep breath, trying to shake off the gnawing dread that had been building since Mark's call. He glanced up at the house. It loomed in the dim glow of the streetlight, its windows dark, like hollow eyes staring out into the night. The usual warmth he remembered from childhood visits to Mark's house was gone. In its place was a suffocating sense of coldness, an emptiness that seemed to seep from the very walls. The front door creaked open before James even reached it. Mark stood there, his face pale, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. James Mark's voice was low, barely above a whisper. He looked over his shoulder nervously before stepping aside to let James in. The moment James crossed the threshold, he felt it a heavy, oppressive weight in the air. The kind of weight that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, that made your skin prickle with unease. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone. "She's in the living room," Mark said, his voice strained, like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were dark, shadowed with fear. He gestured down the hallway, and James followed, each step feeling heavier than the last. The living room was dimly lit by a single lamp in the corner, casting long, eerie shadows across the room, and there, sitting on the worn couch, was Aunt Lila. But she wasn't the Aunt Lila James remembered. The vibrant, lively woman who used to laugh and bake cookies for them when they were kids was gone. In her place was a pale, ghostly figure, frail and shrunken, her skin almost translucent under the soft light. She sat hunched over, staring blankly at the wall, her once bright eyes now dull and distant. Her hands, resting limply in her lap, trembled slightly, as though she was cold, though the house wasn't cold at all. If anything, it was stiflingly warm, the air thick with something James couldn't quite place, something unsettling, like the faint smell of decay, or the lingering presence of something unseen. "Aunt Lila," James whispered, stepping closer. Her head turned slowly toward him, her eyes sluggishly focusing, as if it took all her strength just to acknowledge his presence. She blinked once, twice, and then her lips parted, but no sound came out at first. It was as if she had forgotten how to speak. Finally, her voice, soft and raspy, broke the heavy silence. "James," she breathed, her voice barely more than a hoarse whisper, the sound scraping against the air like sandpaper. "You came." James swallowed hard, trying to force a reassuring smile, but it felt brittle on his face. "Of course I came," Mark told me, "about everything." Her eyes flickered with something, fear, perhaps, or maybe recognition. She nodded slowly, her movements lethargic, almost mechanical. "I shouldn't have come back," she muttered, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I brought it with me." James exchanged a glance with Mark, who stood in the corner, wringing his hands, his eyes wide with worry. "What do you mean? What happened?" James asked gently, crouching down beside her, trying to meet her eyes. Aunt Lila's hands trembled more violently now, and she clenched them into fists, her knuckles turning white. "We went to the mountains," she began, her voice trembling. "A small village, so isolated, so far away. It was supposed to be peaceful, a break from everything. Her breath hitched, and for a moment it seemed like she wouldn't be able to continue. James waited, his heart thudding in his chest. At first it was, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Beautiful even. The village was old, untouched by time, but at night she shivered violently, as if the memory itself was too much to bear. At night we heard things. Voices. James felt a chill creep down his spine. What kind of voices? Aunt Lila's eyes darted to the shadows in the room, her expression wild for a brief second, like a trapped animal. Not human, she whispered, her voice so low that James had to strain to hear her. They weren't human. They were something else. They whispered in the dark, called out to us. But there was no one there, no one but them. James felt the room go colder despite the warmth of the air. His skin prickled with unease, his instincts screaming that whatever Aunt Lila was describing, it was far from over. And then Aunt Lila's voice broke, and tears welled up in her eyes. And then he disappeared. My husband, one night he just vanished. Mark, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward, his voice shaky. We found a note, James, a note that didn't make any sense. James stood up, his heart pounding as Mark handed him a crumpled piece of paper. The handwriting was frantic, scrawled in uneven lines. It read, "It's here. It knows. Don't follow me." James' hand trembled as he held the note. There was something deeply unsettling about the words, as if they carried the weight of impending doom. When did this happen? James asked, his voice strained. 2 weeks ago, Mark answered, his voice barely above a whisper. She came back here, and ever since. The house hasn't been the same. James looked back at Aunt Lila, who was now staring blankly at the note in his hand. Her eyes had glazed over again, as though she had retreated into some dark corner of her mind where no one could reach her. What do you mean, the house hasn't been the same? James asked, his voice tight with dread. Mark swallowed hard, glancing nervously around the room. There are things happening here. Footsteps in the middle of the night when no one's walking. Objects moving on their own. Sometimes we hear whispers, like someone's in the next room, but when we go to check, no one's there. James's mouth went dry. Have you seen anything? Mark hesitated, his face paling. Once, late at night, I saw a shadow moving across the hallway. It wasn't a person, James. It was something else. A cold wave of fear washed over James, and for a moment, the air felt too thick to breathe. He looked back at Aunt Lila, who sat frozen in her seat, her gaze still distant. Whatever had happened in that village, whatever had taken her husband, it wasn't done with her. And now it was here, in this house with them. We can't stay here, James said suddenly, his voice firm. We need to get you out of this house. But Aunt Lila shook her head, her eyes flickering with a brief, wild intensity. It's too late, she whispered, her voice cracking. It's already here. It won't let us leave. A sudden, sharp noise cut through the air, a soft but distinct creak, like the sound of a door slowly opening. James froze, his heart hammering in his chest as he turned toward the hallway. Did you hear that? Mark whispered, his voice trembling. James nodded, his eyes fixed on the darkened hallway. The house was still too still, and then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, a slow, deliberate movement in the shadows. A figure, dark and indistinct, watching them. James felt his blood turn to ice. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything he could understand. And it was here with them right now. Aunt Lila let out a low, broken sob, her hands clutching at her chest. It's here, she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. It followed me. James could feel it now, the oppressive weight in the air, the presence that lurked just beyond the edge of reason. Something ancient, something dark, something that had no place in the world of the living. And it was watching them. He glanced at Mark, whose face was white with terror. We need to leave, James said, his voice barely steady. But deep down, he knew it was too late. Part 3. A desperate plea. The heavy scent of illness clung to the air like a thick fog, suffocating, inescapable. The house was darker now, the shadows longer, deeper, like they were growing, swallowing the light and refusing to give it back. Aunt Lila lay in the center of it all, her frail form barely visible under the weight of the blankets that seemed to engulf her. The woman James once knew lively, warm, and full of life was now a ghostly silhouette, a withered shell who could barely move without pain rippling through her body. James and Mark stood at her bedside, the tension in the room heavy, as if they were standing at the edge of some terrible abyss. Aunt Lila's breaths were shallow, her chest rising and falling with effort, her eyes sunken deep into her skull. The pale, ghostly complexion of her skin made her seem more like a figure from a nightmare than the woman who had cared for them both in their youth. She turned her head slightly, her gaze shifting between them, and her lips trembled as she struggled to speak. You have to go back," she whispered, the words barely audible. Each syllable seemed to drain what little energy she had left. "You have to find out what happened to him." James glanced at Mark, whose face was ashen, his brow furrowed in anxiety. The weight of his aunt's words pressed down on both of them, a pressure they could almost feel in their bones. "We will," James said softly, but Aunt Lila's eyes flashed with desperation. "No," she rasped, her voice louder now, frantic. "You don't understand. This thing. It followed me. It's still here." Her eyes darted to the shadows in the corner of the room, as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. "It took him. And now it wants me too." Her words hung in the air, heavy, oppressive. James's stomach twisted. He could see the terror in her eyes, the fear that had consumed her completely. Whatever had happened to Aunt Lila and husband, whatever had followed them back from that cursed mountain village, it wasn't finished. James crouched beside her bed, his voice gentle but urgent. "What do you mean, Aunt Lila? What happened to him? What followed you back?" Tears welled in her eyes, and her fingers, pale and thin like brittle twigs, clutched at the sheets. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know what it is. But it's not human. It's something. Dark. Evil." We heard voices, whispers, and then he was gone. I can still hear them sometimes. Even now Mark shifted uneasily beside James, the fear in his eyes mirroring his arms. "She's been hearing them ever since she came back," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "At night in the house, whispers, footsteps. And sometimes shadows." James felt a cold shiver creep down his spine. He had heard the stories from Mark, but standing here now, seeing the fear etched into Aunt Lila's face, he realized how real this was for them. This wasn't just paranoia, this wasn't a figment of her imagination. Something was tormenting her, something beyond what they could comprehend. "We need to go back," Aunt Lila said, her voice shaking with desperation. "You have to go back to the village, find out what happened to him, before it takes me to..." The fear in her voice sent a chill through the room, as if the very air had dropped several degrees. James could feel it too, that unsettling sense of being watched, as if something unseen lurked just beyond the corner of his vision. The shadows seemed to press in closer, darker, as if they were alive, moving with a sinister intent. James nodded slowly, feeling the gravity of what she was asking. It was insane, the idea of going back to that village, to confront whatever malevolent force had taken her husband. But it was the only way. They couldn't leave her like this, trapped in fear, waiting for something worse to happen. "We'll go," James said, his voice firm now, though inside fear twisted in his gut like a knife. "We'll go back to the village, find out what happened. I promise." Aunt Lila's gaze softened, relief washing over her frail features, but the terror still lingered just beneath the surface. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It doesn't want you to find out. It'll try to stop you." James's heart skipped a beat, the weight of her warning settling in his chest like a leaden stone. He glanced at Mark, who nodded grimly, his expression tense. They both understood the danger, the darkness they were about to face. As James stood, ready to leave the room, Aunt Lila's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with a surprising strength. Her eyes wide and terrified, locked onto his, her voice trembling with a final plea. "If you don't come back," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "It'll take me two." James swallowed hard, feeling the gravity of her words sink into his bones. There was no room for error. If they didn't figure out what had happened, if they didn't confront the thing that had taken her husband, it would come for her next. And perhaps it would come for them too. That night, James couldn't shake the feeling that the walls of Mark's house were closing in on him, as if the air itself had become suffocating, thick with unseen menace. The shadows in every corner seemed to pulse, as if alive with something dark and hungry. Every creak, every groan of the house made his heart race, his mind conjuring images of something lurking just out of sight, waiting to strike. Mark was quiet, his eyes darting nervously to the darkened corners of the room. Neither of them could bring themselves to speak, as if the silence was the only thing keeping whatever was out there at bay. Finally, Mark broke the tension, his voice hushed. "Do you think we'll find him, James? Do you think he's still alive?" James wanted to give him hope, wanted to reassure him that they would find Aunt Lila's husband and bring him home. But he couldn't shake the gnawing dread that had settled in his chest. The truth was, he didn't know. Whatever had taken him, whatever dark force had followed Aunt Lila back, it wasn't something they could fight with logic or reason. "I don't know," James said quietly. "But we have to try." Mark nodded, but the fear in his eyes remained. He knew as well as James that whatever awaited them in that cursed village was far beyond anything they had ever encountered before. The next morning, the air outside was thick with fog, the kind that clung to everything and made the world seem smaller, more claustrophobic. The mountains loomed in the distance, shrouded in mist, like silent sentinels guarding some terrible secret. James and Mark packed lightly just the essentials: a flashlight, a map, and a few supplies. But it was the weight of the unknown that hung heavy between them, an unspoken understanding that they were walking into something dangerous, something they might not return from. As they approached the car, Mark hesitated, his eyes scanning the horizon, as if looking for a sign, some kind of reassurance that they weren't making a huge mistake. "What if? What if we're too late?" Mark asked, his voice small, almost childlike in its fear. James didn't answer at first. The truth was, he had no idea what they would find in that village, or if they would find anything at all. But he couldn't let Aunt Lila's Plea go unanswered. She was counting on them, her life was hanging in the balance. "We won't know unless we go," James finally said, his voice steady, though his hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. The drive toward the mountains was long, the fog thickening as they climbed higher. The road wound through dense forests, the trees crowding together like silent witnesses to some ancient, forgotten horror. Every so often, James would glance at Mark, who sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his face pale, his eyes distant. As they neared the village, the atmosphere grew heavier, as if the very air was infused with some malevolent presence. The trees seemed darker, their branches twisted in unnatural ways. The road narrowed, and James had to slow the car to a crawl as they approached the outskirts of the village. There it was, nestled in the shadow of the mountains, a place untouched by time, or perhaps abandoned by it. The village was small, no more than a handful of houses, their roofs sagging under the weight of years. The fog clung to the ground, swirling around their feet as they stepped out of the car, enveloping the village in an eerie silence. James could feel it immediately, the presence Aunt Lila had spoken of. It was here, watching them, waiting. His skin prickled with unease, and his breath came in shallow gasps as they walked deeper into the village, the oppressive weight of dread pressing down on them with each step. Mark's voice was tight with fear. "Do you think it's still here?" James didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew the answer. Something was waiting for them in that village. And it was far worse than they had imagined. Part 4. The journey to the mountain village. The road to the mountain village was suffocatingly narrow, winding through dense forests that seemed to close in tighter with every mile. The towering trees loomed over the car, their twisted branches stretching across the grey sky. Scarlet out fingers. Fog clung to the ground, swirling lazily in the early morning light, wrapping everything in a thick, eerie silence. As James drove, he could feel the weight of the isolation settling on his chest, each curve in the road bringing them further from the world they knew and closer to the unknown. Mark sat beside him, pale and silent, his hands gripping the map tightly, as if the flimsy paper was the only thing tethering him to reality. Every so often, James glanced at him, hoping for a reassuring word or even a look, but Mark's eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, his jaw clenched. They hadn't spoken much since leaving the house. There was too much hanging in the air between them, too many unanswered questions, too much fear. Neither of them wanted to say it aloud, but it was there, lurking beneath every glance and every breath the terror of what they might find. As they drove deeper into the mountains, the landscape grew harsher, more unforgiving. The trees were gnarled and ancient, their bark blackened and rough, as if burned by some unknown fire. The air was colder up here, sharp and biting, with a faint metallic tang that made James's stomach churn. He could feel the tension tightening in his muscles, his senses on high alert, as if he were waiting for anything to jump out from the shadows. How much further, James asked, his voice tight. Mark unfolded the map with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the jagged lines and handwritten notes. Not much, he murmured. A few more miles, maybe the road twisted and turned, the car's tires crunching on the gravel. James's hands gripped the steering wheel harder, his knuckles white. He felt a strange pressure in his chest, a sensation that had been building ever since he'd left the house, a sense of being watched, of being hunted. The fog was thick now, a suffocating blanket that reduced their visibility to just a few feet ahead. Every shadow, every flicker of movement from the trees felt like a threat, something lurking just beyond their edge of sight. And then, without warning, the village appeared. It was like stumbling into another world. One moment, they were surrounded by nothing but forest and fog, and the next, the narrow road opened into a clearing, and there it was, the village, nestled in the shadow of the mountains. The houses were old and weathered, their wooden frames sagging under the weight of time. The roofs were thatched with thick straw, and the windows were dark, lifeless. Smoke curled lazily from a few chimneys, but there was no sign of movement, no sign of life. It was as if the entire village was holding its breath, waiting for something. James slowed the car to a stop at the edge of the village, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the low hum of the engine and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. Mark swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the empty street ahead. "This is it," he whispered. "This is where they stayed." James nodded, but the unease twisting in his gut only deepened. He stepped out of the car, the cold mountain air hitting him like a slap. The village was still, unnaturally so. There were no birds, no insects, nothing. Just silence. Even the fog seemed to hang heavier here, thick and unmoving, as if it were hiding something beneath its shroud. As they walked deeper into the village, the sense of dread grew more palpable. Every house they passed seemed abandoned, though there were signs of recent habitation clothes hanging limply on a line, an old bicycle leaning against a fence, a stack of firewood neatly piled beside a door. It was as if the villagers had simply vanished, leaving everything behind. "Do you think anyone's here?" Mark asked, his voice buried more than a whisper. James didn't answer immediately. He could feel it, the presence that had haunted them since Aunt Lila's plea, the dark, oppressive weight of something watching, waiting. He glanced around, half expecting to see movement in one of the windows, but there was nothing. Just those dark, lifeless houses staring back at him. "We need to find someone," James said, his voice low. "We need answers." They continued through the village, their footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the quiet. The houses became more spread out as they neared the center of the village, and the air grew colder, the fog thicker. And then, just as they rounded a corner, they saw it, a figure, hunched and bent, standing in the middle of the road. James stopped, his heart leaping into his throat. Mark froze beside him, his eyes wide with fear. The figure was an old man, his clothes ragged and torn, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He stood motionless, staring at them from the shadows, his body so still it was almost unnatural. James took a step forward, his breath catching in his throat. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing in the silence. The old man didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there watching them, his head slightly tilted, as if studying them from afar. The air seemed to go colder around him, the fog swirling in strange patterns at his feet. Mark grabbed James's arm, his voice trembling. "We need to leave," he whispered. Now, but before James could respond, the old man moved. It was sudden, almost too quick to register. He took a step toward them, his movements jerky, unnatural. James felt a surge of panic rise in his chest, his heart racing. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. "Who are you?" James demanded, his voice cracking with fear. The old man stopped, his head lifting slightly. And then, in a voice that was barely human, barely more than a guttural rasp, he spoke. Leave the word sent a chill through James's body, freezing him in place. The old man's eyes, though hidden in shadow, seemed to bore into him, filled with something dark, something twisted. James couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Mark tugged on his arm, his voice frantic. "James, let's go," but James was rooted to the spot, his mind racing. There was something about the old man, something familiar. The way he moved, the way he spoke, it was as if he had seen it before, heard it before, and then it hit him. The old man's voice, it was the same voice from Aunt Lila's nightmares, the voice she had heard in the village, the one that had whispered to her in the dark, the voice that had taken her husband. James's stomach twisted with fear. "Who are you?" he asked again, though his voice was barely more than a whisper now. The old man smiled, a slow, eerie grin that sent shivers down James's spine. "You'll find out," he rasped, his voice dripping with malice. Before James could react, the old man turned and disappeared into the fog, his figure dissolving like smoke. For a moment, James and Mark stood there, frozen, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on them. The village seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, more threatening. James's mind raced, his thoughts spiraling into panic. What the hell was that? Mark gasped, his eyes wide with terror. James shook his head, his heart pounding. "I don't know," he whispered, "but we need to find out." They continued through the village, their footsteps quickening, their eyes darting nervously to the shadows around them. The houses grew smaller, more dilapidated, as they reached the far edge of the village. And then they saw it, a large, crumbling building at the top of a small hill, its windows dark and shattered. "That's it," Mark said, his voice trembling. "That's where they stayed." James felt a chill run down his spine as he stared up at the building. It looked abandoned, forgotten. The roof sagged, the walls were cracked, and the windows were boarded up, as if something inside was trying to keep the world out, or perhaps keep something trapped within. "We have to go inside," James said, though every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn and run. Mark nodded, though his face was pale with fear. Together, they approached the building, the wind howling through the broken windows, carrying with it a faint whisper that sent shivers down their spines. As they reached the front door, James paused, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He could feel it now, stronger than ever, the presence, the darkness that had haunted Aunt Lila. It was here, in this village, in this building. And whatever it was, it wasn't finished with them. James took a deep breath, his hand trembling as he turned the knob. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the dark, empty interior beyond. The air inside was thick, musty, and cold, like stepping into a forgotten tomb. "We have to find out what happened here," James whispered, though his voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Mark stepped inside beside them, his eyes wide with fear. "What if we don't like what we find?" James didn't answer. Deep down, he knew the answer already. Whatever had happened here, whatever had taken Aunt Lila's husband, was far worse than they could imagine. Part 5. The Haunted House. Their return to Aunt Lila's house felt like stepping into the belly of a beast. The air inside the house was thick, oppressive, as if it had a weight of its own. It pressed down on James and Mark, filling their lungs with a cold, unnatural chill. The house, which once had the familiar comfort of a family home, now felt like a tomb silent, except for the soft creaks and groans that echoed through the empty halls. As soon as they crossed the threshold, the sensation hit James like a wave. There was something in the house, something dark and angry. It was as if the walls themselves were watching, the air thrumming with a malevolent energy that made his skin crawl. He glanced at Mark, who was visibly pale, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Do you feel that?" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible, as if he was afraid speaking too loudly might wake whatever was lurking. James nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. It was unmistakable now. The presence, the darkness they had been running from, had followed them back. Or perhaps it had never left at all. The first night passed uneasily. They tried to ignore the strange sounds that echoed through the house footsteps in the hallway when no one was there, the soft creak of a door opening on its own, the rustle of something moving in the walls. But as the hours ticked by, it became harder to dismiss. The house was alive with something dark, something James could feel pulsing beneath his skin. Aunt Lila was worse. She hadn't left her bed since he returned. Her breathing was labored, each gasp for air more desperate than the last, as if something was slowly squeezing the life out of her. Her eyes were wide with fear, darting around the room, searching the shadows for something only she could see. "They're here," she whispered that night, her voice trembling. "They've come back." Mark and James exchanged worried glances, but neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The fear in Aunt Lila's voice was enough. Whatever it was, whatever had taken her husband was here, and it was growing stronger. The second night things escalated. They were sitting in the living room, the fire crackling weakly in the hearth, when the first scream tore through the house. It wasn't a normal scream, it was a sound ripped straight from a nightmare. A high-pitched guttural wail that sent a cold shock through James's body. It came from upstairs, from Aunt Lila's room. Without thinking, James and Mark bolted from their chairs, racing up the stairs two at a time, their hearts pounding in their ears. They burst into Aunt Lila's room to find her sitting up in bed, her eyes wide, staring at the far corner of the room. Her body was trembling violently, her hands clutching the blanket so tightly her knuckles had turned white. James's breath caught in his throat as he followed her gaze to the corner. At first he saw nothing, just shadows, deep and impenetrable. But then, slowly, the darkness shifted, forming a shape, a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs and a face that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. Its eyes black, hollow pits bored into James, freezing him in place. For a long moment, the figure just stood there, its form barely distinguishable from the shadows that clung to it. Then, without a sound, it moved, its body contorting unnaturally, its limbs bending in ways that no human should be able to. It slid toward the bed, the air growing colder with each step. "Do something," Mark shouted, his voice shaking with terror. But James couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, his body locked in place by the sheer, overwhelming presence of the thing in the corner. He wanted to speak, to shout, to scream, but the words died in his throat. All he could do was watch as the figure drew closer to Aunt Lila, its face twisted into a grotesque predatory grin, and then, just as it reached the edge of the bed, it vanished. The room fell into an oppressive silence, the only sound the ragged breathing of Aunt Lila, who collapsed back onto her pillow, her body drenched in cold sweat. James finally managed to move, his legs shaky, his hands trembling. He rushed to Aunt Lila's side, feeling her pulse, her skin cold to the touch. "It's getting worse," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's coming for me." James's stomach twisted with dread. He glanced at Mark, who was pacing nervously by the door, his hands pulling at his hair in frustration. "We can't stay here," Mark muttered. "We have to leave. We have to get her out of here." James wanted to agree, wanted to get as far away from the house as possible, but something told him it wouldn't matter. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't bound by walls or doors. It had followed Aunt Lila back from the village, and it would follow them wherever they went. That night, neither of them slept. The house was alive with activity. Whispers echoed through the walls, faint, disembodied voices murmuring words that neither James nor Mark could understand. Shadows flickered just out of sight, darting between the corners of the room, their presence sending icy shivers down James's spine. At one point, James thought he saw a figure standing at the foot of his bed, a tall, dark silhouette that watched him with those hollow, black eyes. But when he blinked, it was gone, leaving behind only the lingering sense of dread that wrapped around him like a noose. The third night was the worst. It started with the cold, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into the house, cutting through the walls, the floors, even the very air. It was a kind of cold that burned, that froze the blood in your veins and made your breath come in ragged gasps. James and Mark huddled by the fireplace, but no amount of heat seemed to touch the icy chill that filled the house. And then the banging started. It came from the walls, at first heavy, rhythmic thuds that shook the very foundation of the house. Then it moved to the windows, the doors, each blow louder and more forceful than the last. The house seemed to groan under the pressure, as if something massive was trying to force its way inside. Aunt Lila screamed again, and James and Mark raced to her room. But this time she wasn't alone. The figure from the corner was back, standing at the foot of her bed. But now it wasn't alone. There were others, dark, twisted figures that crowded around the room, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. They whispered in unison, their voices low and guttural, a language that James couldn't understand but instinctively feared. James's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the scene before him. The figures moved closer to Aunt Lila, their movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. The room seemed to pulse with their energy, a sickly, dark power that made the air thick and suffocating. Mark grabbed James's arm, pulling him back. "We have to do something," he shouted. But James was frozen, his mind racing. What could they do? These weren't people, they weren't spirits they could reason with. These were something else, something ancient and malevolent, a force that had come from the darkest corners of the earth to claim what it wanted. The figure at the foot of the bed reached out, its long, skeletal fingers stretching toward Aunt Lila. She whimpered, her body shaking violently, her eyes wide with terror. "No," James shouted, finally breaking free of his paralysis. He lunged forward, grabbing the nearest object, a heavy candlestick, from the dresser and swung it at the figure. To his shock, the candlestick passed through the figure as if it were made of smoke. The thing didn't even flinch. Instead, it turned its head slowly toward James, its hollow eyes locking onto him with a predatory gaze. And then it smiled. James staggered back, his heart hammering in his chest. The room seemed to close in around him, the shadows pressing closer, suffocating him. The figures moved toward him now, their bodies twisting and writhing like serpents, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. James felt a cold hand wrap around his wrist, pulling him back. "Mark! Run!" Mark shouted, his voice shaking with fear. "We have to get out of here," they bolted from the room, the figures' whispers following them as they raced down the stairs, their footsteps echoing loudly in the empty house. The front door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang, the sound reverberating through the house like a final warning. They collapsed onto the porch, gasping for breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. The cold night air beat at their skin, but it was nothing compared to the chill that still clung to them from inside the house. "We can't stay here," Mark panted, his eyes wide with fear. "It's not safe," James nodded, his mind racing. They had to leave, had to get Aunt Lila out of the house. But as he looked back at the darkened windows, he knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was in that house wasn't bound by the walls. It was something older, something more powerful than any of them could understand. And it wasn't going to stop until it had what it wanted. As they sat on the porch, trying to catch their breath, the house behind them seemed to grow darker, more malevolent. The air was heavy with the presence of something ancient and twisted, a force that had no intention of letting them go. James shuddered, his skin crawling with the knowledge that they were no longer alone. The thing in the house was watching them, waiting, and it was only a matter of time before it struck again. Part 6. The Missing Husband's Secret. The house was cloaked in an unsettling stillness as the morning sun filtered through the grimy windows, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch across the floor like grasping fingers. James and Mark sat at the kitchen table, their faces drawn and pale, the events of the previous night weighing heavily on their minds. Aunt Lila was resting upstairs, her condition worsening with each passing hour. They had little time before whatever malignant force haunted the house consumed her entirely. "We have to find out what really happened to Uncle Richard," Mark said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and fear. "This thing. It's tied to him. It's why it's here," James nodded, his eyes heavy but alert. He must have known something. That's why he went back to the village. There was a heavy silence between them as the realization sunk in. Richard hadn't just disappeared, he had walked straight into the heart of the darkness that now plagued them. But what had he found? Mark stood abruptly, pacing the small kitchen, running his hands through his hair in frustration. Why didn't he tell anyone? Why did he go alone? James remained silent, his mind working furiously to piece together the fragments of the story that had haunted Aunt Lila for years. There was something deeper at play, something ancient and far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. He could feel it in the air, that suffocating presence that seemed to grow stronger the more they delved into Richard's secrets. "We need to find his journal," James said suddenly, his voice firm. He must have kept records notes about what he was experiencing, what he found out in that village. Mark stopped pacing, his face pale. "I don't know. I haven't seen it since he disappeared. But you're right, he always kept notes. It could be somewhere in the house." They split up, searching through the cluttered rooms, rifling through drawers, shelves, and old boxes. James felt the oppressive weight of the house bearing down on him with each step. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind through the windows set his nerves on edge. It was as though the house itself was alive, watching them, waiting for them to uncover a truth it wanted to keep buried. After what felt like hours, James found it. Tucked away in the corner of Richard's old study, hidden beneath a stack of dusty papers and forgotten books, was a leather-bound journal. It was worn, the edges frayed and the pages yellowed with age, as if it had been handled often, perhaps too often. James's hands trembled slightly as he flipped it open, the faint smell of old ink and paper rising from its pages. Mark appeared in the doorway, his eyes locking onto the journal in James's hands. "You found it?" James nodded, his throat dry. "Let's see what Richard knew." They sat down together, the journal between them. As James turned the pages, the scrawl of Richard's handwriting grew more frantic, more desperate. What had started as simple observations about the village soon turned into something far darker: notes on strange occurrences, unnatural events, and finally, mention of a ritual. James's pulse quickened as they reached the final entries. July 15, they heard it again. Tonight, the same voice from the first night we arrived at the village. "Hello?" Cthulhu whisper. "It calls my name now. It knows me. Lila hasn't heard it, but I can feel it watching us. Something is wrong here. Something is..." July 17, the villagers avoid me now. Their smiles have turned to vague glances. They know something I don't. There's an old man who keeps appearing outside our window at night. I thought it was a dream at first, but Lila saw him too. I spoke to him today. His eyes were hollow. He told me the village carries a curse, one passed down through generations. A ritual was performed long ago, and the village paid the price. But it's not over. The curse demands more. July 19, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being followed. Even when I'm alone, I can feel eyes on me. I've started seeing things in the house, shadows that move when they shouldn't, objects shifting on their own. Lila thinks I'm losing it, but I know what I saw. There's something here, something dark. It's feeding on us. July 21, the old man came to me again. He warned me. "Leave before it claims you too," he said. "But I can't leave. Not yet. I've been hearing the whispers more frequently now. They've been calling me to the woods, deeper into the mountain." July 22, Andy followed the whispers today. "I don't know why, but I couldn't resist. They led me deep into the forest, further than I had ever gone before. There, in a clearing surrounded by ancient trees, I found something. Stones arranged in a perfect circle, covered in strange markings I've never seen. They were older than the village itself. This is where it happened. This is where the ritual took place July 23, though the whispers are louder now, more insistent. They tell me I'm close, that I must go back. I know what they want. The old man warned me that the ritual requires a sacrifice alive for the curse to stay dormant. I fear it may have been reawakened by our presence. The curse ... is alive. I feel it breathing in the very air of this place. It's everywhere and it's hungry. July 25, I didn't tell Lila. I couldn't. She wouldn't understand, and I don't want to drag her into this any more than she already is. But I have to go back. I have to finish what they started. I feel it in my bones, this thing, this presence. Won't stop until it gets what it wants. It's using me. I can hear it in my mind now, clearer than ever. Tonight, I'll go back to the clearing. I'll find a way to end this. Or die trying. The entry stopped abruptly. The rest of the pages were blank. James and Mark sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of Richard's final words pressing down on them like a lead blanket. The air in the room felt thicker, colder, as if the house itself was reacting to the discovery of the journal. A faint chill ran down James's spine as he closed the book, his mind racing with the implications of what Richard had uncovered. He knew, Mark said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He knew something terrible was waiting for him in that village, and he still went back. James nodded slowly, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place in his mind. Richard had been drawn into something far older and more dangerous than they could have imagined. The curse that plagued the village wasn't just some local superstition, it was real. And it had followed Richard home, bringing its darkness with it. That's why he disappeared, James said, his voice hoarse. He went back to the village, hoping to stop whatever was happening, but it looks like the curse was too powerful. It consumed him. Mark's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white with the pressure. Then we're next, aren't we? Whatever he couldn't stop is coming for us. The air seemed to hum with tension, the very walls of the house pressing in on them. James glanced around the room, half expecting to see those shadowy figures from the night before materializing in the corners again. But the room remained eerie still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for them to act. We have to go back to the village, James said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. We need to find that clearing, the stones Richard mentioned. If the curse started there, then maybe that's where we can stop it. Mark's eyes widened in shock. Are you insane? You saw what that place did to him. We don't even know if he stopped short, unable to finish the sentence, the words too painful to speak aloud. I know, James said softly. But if we don't go, whatever's haunting this house will keep coming for us, for Aunt Lila. We can't just sit here and wait for it to claim us too. Mark hesitated, fear flickering in his eyes. But after a long moment, he nodded, his jaw set in determination. You're right, we'll go. We'll finish what my uncle started. The two of them gathered what little supplies they could, flashlights, knives, and the journal, which had become their only guide to the nightmare that lay ahead. They left Aunt Lila resting in her room, hoping she would be safe for the few hours they would be gone. As they stepped outside, the sun was already setting, casting the village in a pale, sickly light. The road leading back to the Cursor Mountain felt longer than before, the journey ahead of them weighed down by the knowledge of what waited in those ancient woods. The air grew colder with each step, the trees looming overhead like twisted, skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. They didn't speak as they walked, the oppressive silence of the forest swallowing their words before they could form. James could feel the weight of the journal in his backpack, the words of Richard's final entries echoing in his mind. He tried to focus on the task at hand, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something or someone was following them. As they neared the village, the oppressive energy they had felt during their first visit returned, stronger this time. The air seemed to pulse with a malevolent presence, thick and suffocating. James's breath hitched in his throat as they passed through the village square, the empty windows of the houses staring back at them like hollow eyes. The villagers had been right to avoid this place. There was something ancient and terrible here, something that had been waiting for far too long. "Do you remember the way to the clearing?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. James nodded, though his memory of the path was hazy. It felt like the forest itself was shifting around them, the trees warping and twisting in unnatural ways as they pressed deeper into the woods. Every now and then, James would catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of his eye, a shadow slipping between the trees, a figure darting behind a trunk. But whenever he turned to look, there was nothing there. The whisper started again, soft at first, barely audible over the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. But as they moved further into the forest, they grew louder, more insistent. James could feel them tugging at the edges of his mind, trying to pull him off the path and deeper into the darkness. "They're calling us," Mark muttered, his eyes wide with fear. Just like they called him. James swallowed hard, pushing the fear down as best he could. Ignore them. Just keep moving. After what felt like hours of walking, they finally found it, the clearing. It was exactly as Richard had described in his journal. A perfect circle of stones, each one covered in strange, indecipherable markings that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. The air in the clearing was thick, heavy, with a sense of ancient power. It hummed with a dark, primal energy, as if the very earth beneath their feet was alive with the curse that had been awakened so long ago. James and Mark stood at the edge of the clearing, their hearts pounding in their chests, their breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. "This is it," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. "This is where it happened." James stepped forward, his eyes scanning the stones, searching for any sign of what Richard had been looking for. He knelt by the largest stone, his fingers tracing the strange symbols carved into its surface. The stone was cold to the touch, unnaturally cold, as if it had been drained of all warmth by the curse that lingered in this place. "There's something here," James muttered, his voice low and tense. "Something beneath the stones." Mark took a hesitant step forward. "What do you mean?" James didn't answer. His instincts were screaming at him, a deep, primal sense of unease gnawing at the edges of his mind. He pressed his hands against the stone, feeling the vibrations of the ancient curse pulsing beneath his fingertips. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shifted. Mark let out a startled yelp as the stones around them began to tremble, the earth itself groaning in protest. The air grew colder, the whispers louder, more frenzied, as if the very forest was waking up from a long, cursed sleep. And then from beneath the largest stone, something began to rise. A low, guttural moan echoed through the clearing, sending a jolt of terror through James's body. He stumbled back, his heart racing as he watched in horror as a figure began to emerge from the ground, a twisted, contorted shape, its limbs bent at unnatural angles, its face hidden beneath a tangle of matted hair and rotting flesh. It was Richard, or what was left of him. James's stomach lurched, bile rising in his throat as the figure stood before them, its hollow eyes locking onto them with a gaze that sent ice-cold fear coursing through his veins. This wasn't the man Aunt Lila had loved, the man who had ventured into the woods to find answers. This was something else, something far darker, far more ancient, that had taken Richard's body and twisted it into a grotesque puppet of the curse. Mark's scream shattered the air, piercing through the whispers as he stumbled back, his eyes wide with horror. No, it can't be. But it was. James took a shaky step back, his mind racing, his heart pounding so loudly in his ears he could barely hear the wind anymore. The curse had claimed Richard had twisted him into a vessel for its malevolent power. And now it was coming for them. Before James could move, Richard's twisted form lunged forward with inhuman speed, its bony hands reaching for them with a strength fueled by the curse itself. James and Mark barely had time to react, diving out of the way just as the creature slammed into the ground where they had stood. The air crackled with energy, the clearing humming with the dark power of the curse as Richard's form twisted and contorted, his body writhing like a puppet on invisible strings. He was no longer human, no longer the man they had known. He was something else entirely, something that should never have existed in this world. James scrambled to his feet, his mind racing for a way out. There had to be a way to stop this, a way to end the curse. But as Richard's twisted form rose once more, his empty eyes locking onto them with a chilling intensity, James realized that they were running out of time. The curse wasn't going to let them go, not without a fight. Part 7. The Confrontation. The air inside Aunt Lila's house felt as thick as fog, suffocating James and Mark with its oppressive weight. Every corner of the room seemed to hum with an unseen presence, the shadows deepening as though alive, watching, waiting. Aunt Lila lay in her bed, her once frail body now motionless, her breathing shallow and labored. Her face, pale as a ghost, reflected the terror that had consumed her since the day she returned from the cursed village. The entity had taken everything: her husband, her peace, her life. James stood near the doorway, his heart pounding in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to run. The oppressive energy inside the house had grown worse with every passing moment. It wasn't just a haunting anymore, it was a confrontation, a showdown between them and something far older, far darker than they could have ever imagined. Mark sat at his mother's bedside, his eyes hollow and bloodshot from sleepless nights filled with dread. He held Aunt Lila's hand, her fingers cold and lifeless in his grasp. The fear in the room was palpable, thick as the dust settling in the silence. And then the stillness shattered. A low, guttural moan echoed through the house, vibrating through the walls like the tolling of a death knell. The temperature plummeted, the air freezing in an instant, causing their breath to come out in pale, trembling clouds. James felt a sudden weight on his chest, as if something invisible was pressing down on him, trying to crush the life out of him. Mark's grip tightened on his mother's hand, his voice barely a whisper. It's here. James turned to face the hallway, his heart hammering against his ribcage. The shadows seemed to shift, coiling like snakes in the darkness, drawing closer. And then, from the far end of the hall, the entity appeared. It wasn't like anything James had ever seen before. The figure seemed human in shape, but its form was distorted, wrong. Its limbs were too long, its face a pale mask of twisted agony. Eyes like burning coals glowed from within the void of its skull, fixing their malevolent gaze on the three of them. It drifted toward them, its feet not quite touching the ground, trailing a thick fog that filled the air with the stench of decay. James felt his blood run cold, his breath catching in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, but he couldn't move. The sheer presence of the entity rooted him to the spot, its unholy energy pinning him down like an insect caught in a spider's web. Mark's voice broke the silence, his tone desperate. "What do you want?" The entity stopped, hovering just inside the doorway. Its eyes flared, and suddenly the room was filled with the sound of whispers, thousands of voices all speaking at once, a chaotic chorus of the damned. The words were unintelligible, but the meaning was clear. It was hungry. It wanted them. Aunt Lila stared in her bed, her body convulsing violently as the whispers seemed to crawl beneath her skin. Her eyes snapped open, but they were not her own. They were hollow, black pits, reflecting the same malevolent energy that burned within the entity's gaze. Her mouth opened, and in a voice that was not her own, she spoke. "You cannot stop what has been done." The voice was a low, raspy growl, layered with the sound of countless others. It was ancient, filled with the weight of centuries of suffering. James felt his heart lurch in his chest, his blood turning to ice as he realized what was happening. The entity wasn't just haunting them, it was taking control of Aunt Lila, using her as a vessel. Mark recoiled, horror etched across his face. Mom, Aunt Lila's head twisted unnaturally toward him, her neck cracking with the movement. The entity's voice slithered from her lips, dripping with malice. "She belongs to us now. You all do." James took a step forward, his mind racing. This isn't her. You're not her. The entity laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed through the room like the scraping of bones. Foolish mortal. You think you can fight what you don't understand. James's hands trembled as he reached for the journal in his bag. Richard's final notes had hinted at the nature of the curse, an ancient ritual performed to bind the spirits of the dead to the land. Sacrifices had been made, blood spilled to keep the spirits trapped. But something had gone wrong. The spirits had broken free, and now they sought revenge. The entity seemed to sense his intention, and its form flickered, growing darker, more monstrous, its limbs lengthened, twisting and contorting like serpents. The air around it crackled with energy, and James could feel the pull of the curse, the weight of centuries of torment pressing down on him. "We won't let you take her," Mark growled, standing between his mother and the entity. The entity's eyes flared with anger, and the room seemed to shake with its rage. "You cannot stop us. We are bound to this land, and now so are you." Suddenly the entity lashed out. A wave of force exploded from its body, sending James and Mark crashing against the walls. The air was ripped from their lungs as they hit the floor, gasping for breath. The temperature in the room plummeted even further, frost spreading across the floor and walls, creeping toward them like icy tendrils. James struggled to his feet, his vision swimming as the force of the impact rattled his brain. The entity was looming over Aunt Lila now, its twisted form reaching for her, its fingers elongated into sharp, shadowy claws. He had to act fast. He had to do something, anything to stop it. His mind raced back to the journal, to Richard's desperate final entries. There was something about the stones in the village, the ritual site. That was where it had all started. That was where the spirits were bound. The entity's power came from that place. If they could sever the connection, break the curse. James forced himself to his feet, the weight of the entity's presence pressing down on him like a lead blanket. "Mark," he gasped, "will have to break the curse." The stones. The village Mark looked up from where he lay on the floor, blood trickling from his forehead. His eyes were wild with panic, but he nodded. How James's hands trembled as he pulled the journal from his bag, flipping through the pages with frantic urgency. "There's a passage here, something of disrupting the ritual, severing the bond between the spirits and the land." But before he could finish, the entity let out a deafening screech, its form shifting violently. Aunt Lila's body convulsed on the bed, her skin growing paler by the second, as though the life was being drained from her. The entity was feeding on her, using her as a conduit for its power. James's heart pounded in his chest as he read the passage aloud, the words spilling from his lips in a desperate rush. "The spirits are bound by blood, by sacrifice. To break the curse, you must sever the link. You must return the souls to the earth." The entity roared in fury, the sound shaking the very foundation of the house. Its form flickered, momentarily destabilized by James's words. It lashed out again, sending a wave of energy crashing toward them, but this time James was ready. He ducked, grabbing Mark by the arm and pulling him toward the door. "We need to get back to the village," James shouted, his voice barely audible over the entity's shrieking. "It's the only way to stop this." Mark hesitated for a moment, torn between his mother and the fight for their lives. But Aunt Lila's body was no longer hers. The entity had claimed her, and there was nothing they could do for her here. With a heavy heart, Mark nodded and followed James out the door, leaving the haunted house behind. The night was dark and cold as they raced toward the village, the wind howling in their ears. The shadows seemed to close in around them, the oppressive energy of the curse following them with every step. James's breath came in ragged gasps as they neared the clearing, the stones from Richard's journal looming ahead like dark sentinels. "We have to stop it," Mark panted, his face twisted with a mix of fear and determination. "We have to break the curse," James nodded, his eyes fixed on the stones. "We will. We'll end this day." Reached the clearing, the ancient stones glowing faintly in the moonlight. The air was thick with the presence of the spirits, their energy crackling in the space around them. James could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him, the malevolent force that had haunted Aunt Lila's family for years. He stepped forward, placing his hands on the largest stone, his fingers tracing the strange symbols carved into its surface. The air seemed to hum with energy, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. He could feel the power of the spirits beneath the earth, their anger, their hunger. Mark joined him, placing his hand on the stone beside him. Together, they spoke the words from Richard's journal, their voices trembling but resolute. By blood and by sacrifice you are bound. By the earth and the stars, we release you. Return to the earth and let the curse be broken for a moment. Nothing happened. The air was still, the clearing silent. And then, with a deafening roar, the ground beneath them shook violently. The stones began to crack, splitting apart as the earth trembled with the force of the spirits being released. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though the spirits were being pulled back into the earth, their hold on the land finally breaking. The entity's shriek echoed through the clearing, a sound of pure rage and defeat. James and Mark fell to the ground, clutching the stones as the world around them seemed to collapse. The energy in the air crackled, and with one final, deafening roar, the entity was gone. The night fell silent. James and Mark lay on the ground, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. The curse had been broken. The spirits had been released, and the entity that had haunted them, that had taken Aunt Lila, was no more. They had won. Part 8. The Spirit's Defeat. The air inside the room was thick with dread. Every breath felt like swallowing smoke, choking James and Mark with the oppressive weight of the unseen force that clung to the walls. The house trembled with energy as if it were alive, possessed by the malevolent entity that had terrorized Aunt Lila's family for years. But this time they had come prepared. Armed with the ancient ritual, the one they had learned from the village elders, James and Mark had no choice but to confront the spirit head-on, knowing the consequences if they failed. The ritual was their only hope. It had been passed down for generations, a closely guarded secret among the elders who had lived in the cursed mountain village for centuries. The words, written in a script older than any known language, were etched into their minds, and James could feel the weight of its power even before they began to speak. They stood in the center of the house, the floorboards groaning beneath their feet as the entity stirred in the shadows. Aunt Lila's frail body lay motionless in the corner, her chest rising and falling shallowly, each breath a struggle. Her soul, tethered to the dark energy that had followed them from the village, seemed to fade with each passing moment. They were running out of time. James exchanged a glance with Mark. His friend's face was pale, his hands trembling slightly, but there was a fierce determination in his eyes. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about saving their family, about reclaiming what the entity had stolen. "Ready?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded, swallowing hard. "Let's finish this." They began to chant, their voices low and steady, speaking the ancient words that had been handed down through the generations. As the first syllables escaped their lips, the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost formed on the windows, and a biting cold swept through the house. The shadows seemed to deepen, swirling like a living thing, drawn toward the sound of the ritual. The entity did not like it. From the darkness, a guttural growl rumbled through the walls, shaking the very foundation of the house. The shadows twisted and writhed, coiling like serpents around James and Mark, as if trying to strangle the words from their mouths. But they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. The chant grew louder, stronger with each passing second. The ritual was working. Suddenly a blast of cold air slammed into them, knocking James off his feet. He hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him, but the words still tumbled from his lips in a desperate, breathless rush. Mark staggered but remained standing, his voice growing hoarse as he continued the incantation, his eyes locked on the figure now emerging from the shadows. The spirit was no longer hidden. It materialized before them, a grotesque, twisted figure, its form barely recognizable as human. Its limbs were elongated, its fingers sharp like claws, and its face, if it could even be called a face, was a mask of torment and rage. Its eyes burned with an unnatural light, and its mouth stretched into an endless scream, a soundless wail that pierced the air like knives. The spirit hovered just inches off the ground, its dark aura suffocating, its presence so overwhelming that it seemed to bend reality around it. The ritual was weakening it, but the entity was not ready to give up without a fight. It lunged forward, moving with inhuman speed, its claw-like hands reaching for Mark. He barely had time to react, stumbling backward as the spirit's hand grazed his arm. Where it touched, his skin blistered, blackened as if burned by frostbite. Mark screamed, but he didn't stop chanting. "Keep going," James yelled, forcing himself to his feet, his heart hammering in his chest. He grabbed the small stone talisman, the one the village elder had pressed into his hand before they left, and held it out in front of him, the words of the ritual spilling from his mouth with renewed urgency. The talisman posed in his hand, glowing faintly, and the spirit recoiled as if struck, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. The entity hissed, its burning eyes narrowing as it turned its gaze toward James. It knew what he held, knew that it was the key to its undoing. The talisman had been carved from the very stones of the cursed village, forged in blood and sacrifice, the same stones that had bound the spirits to the land. But now it was being used to break that bond. "James," Mark cried, his voice breaking as the spirit lashed out again, this time with a force so powerful it shook the entire house. The floorboards splintered beneath them, and the windows shattered, sending shards of glass raining down around them. The walls groaned, as if the house itself was coming apart at the seams. But James didn't waver. He held the talisman high, his voice rising above the chaos, his words clear and commanding. "In the name of the land and the blood that binds you, I release you." The spirit howled in agony, its form convulsing, twisting into unnatural shapes as the power of the ritual tore through it. Dark smoke billowed from its body, filling the room with the stench of decay. It writhed and clawed at the air, trying to hold on, but the bond was breaking. It was losing its grip. For a moment, it seemed as if the spirit would dissolve into nothingness, banished by the ancient magic that bound it. But then, in a final act of desperation, the entity surged forward, its eyes locking onto James with a burning intensity. And in that moment, the truth was revealed. A voice, soft but unmistakable, whispered from the shadows, a voice that chilled James to his core. It wasn't the spirit's voice. It was Aunt Lila's husband. You don't understand," the voice rasped, echoing through the room. "I'm still here. I never left." James froze, his blood running cold. His eyes widened as the realization hit him like a tidal wave. The spirit wasn't just some malevolent entity, it was bound to Richard, Aunt Lila's husband. He wasn't just a victim. He had become part of the ritual. His soul had been consumed, trapped within the very curse he had sought to unravel. Mark's face twisted in horror as the voice continued, each word like a dagger to the heart. "It's too late. I'm part of this now. I can't leave. I'm bound to it." "Forever no," Mark whispered, shaking his head. "No, that's not possible. You're dead. You can't be." "I'm not dead," the voice interrupted, filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to swallow the room. "Not yet. But I will be soon." The spirit's form flickered violently, and for the briefest of moments, James saw him, Richard, Aunt Lila's husband, his face twisted in agony, his body entwined with the dark energy that had consumed him. He was no longer human. He was a prisoner, bound to the curse, his soul forever tied to the malevolent force that had haunted their family. Mark's eyes filled with tears, his voice breaking as he called out to his father, "Dad, please, let us help you. We can fix this." But Richard shook his head, his form fading in and out of existence. "There's no fixing this, Mark. I made a mistake. I thought I could stop it. But now I'm part of it." James gritted his teeth, his grip tightening on the talisman. "There has to be a way. We can break the curse. We can set you free." But the spirit's eyes flared with fury, and Richard's voice twisted into something darker, something no longer human. "You can't stop what's been done. The ritual is complete. I am bound to this land, just like all the others." The room trembled, the walls groaning under the weight of the entity's power. The shadows thickened, and the air crackled with dark energy as the spirit surged forward once more, its form dissolving into a swirling vortex of smoke and flame. It was going to drag them all down with it, into the same abyss that had claimed Richard. "We have to finish it," James shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the spirit's fury. He raised the talisman high, the ancient words pouring from his lips like a prayer, desperate and raw. "In the name of the land, by the power of blood and sacrifice, I command you return to the earth." The talisman blazed with light, and the spirit let out a final, ear-splitting shriek. Its form convulsed, rioting as the power of the ritual tore it apart. The shadows seemed to implode, collapsing in on themselves as the entity was pulled back into the earth, its grip on the house and on Richard's soul finally broken. For a moment there was silence. Then slowly the house began to settle. The frost melted from the windows, the shadows faded, and the oppressive energy that had filled the air dissipated. James and Mark stood in the center of the room, their bodies trembling with exhaustion, their hearts still racing from the battle. But it was over. The spirit was gone. The curse had been broken. Mark collapsed to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "Dad, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." James placed a hand on his shoulder, his own heart heavy with grief. "He's at peace now, Mark. We did what we could." But the pain of loss hung thick in the air, a reminder that some battles, even when won, came with a terrible cost. Part 9. Aftermath and Reflection. The silence in Aunt Lila's house was unsettling. It was the kind of silence that came after a storm calm, but not peaceful. The battle had ended, and with it, the spirit that had tormented them for so long was gone. Yet the air still felt thick with the weight of all that had happened. The malevolent energy that had once filled the room was no longer present, but in its place lingered a hollow emptiness, an absence that was just as haunting. James stood by the window, watching the first light of dawn break over the horizon. His body ached from exhaustion, every muscle protesting as he shifted his weight. The talisman, which had once glowed with the power of the ritual, now sat lifeless in his hand, its stone surface cold and ordinary. He stared at it for a long moment before tucking it into his pocket. They had won, but at what cost? Behind him, Aunt Lila stirred weakly in her bed. She had been unconscious throughout the final confrontation, her body too frail to endure the intensity of the battle. But now, with the spirit vanquished, there were signs of life returning to her. Her breathing was deeper, her face less pallid. Yet even in her recovery, there was a shadow that clung to her, a grief so profound it seemed to seep into her very bones. Mark sat by her side, his face pale, eyes rimmed with red from crying. He hadn't said much since the entity had been defeated, but James could see the war waging inside him. His friend had faced the impossible, confronted the evil that had claimed his father's life, and emerged victorious. But the victory felt hollow. The man they had come to save was gone, lost forever to the dark ritual that had bound him to the cursed village. "Mark," James began, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark didn't respond. He just stared at Aunt Lila, his fingers lightly brushing her hand. She looked so fragile now, like a leaf on the verge of crumbling. He wasn't sure how much longer she had left, but he knew one thing: she had survived. And for that, he was grateful. But the weight of losing his father hung over him like a shroud. "I don't know if I can ever forgive myself," Mark said, suddenly his voice cracking. I thought we could save him. I really believed we could." James didn't know how to respond. What could he say? That they did everything they could. That sometimes even when you win, you lose. None of it felt right. The truth was, nothing would ever make this okay. The damage had been done, and they would both carry the scars for the rest of their lives. Aunt Lila stared again, her eyes fluttering open. For a brief moment, confusion washed over her face, but then the memories returned slowly, painfully. She turned her head toward Mark, her eyes searching his. "Mark," she whispered, her voice weak. Is it over?" Mark nodded, his throat too tight to speak. She closed her eyes again, a tear slipping down her cheek. "He's really gone, isn't he?" The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Neither of them answered, but the silence was confirmation enough. Aunt Lila's body shook with quiet sobs, and Mark lowered his head, his own tears flowing freely. James turned away, giving them a moment of privacy. He walked into the kitchen, feeling the cold tiles beneath his feet as he tried to collect his thoughts. He poured himself a glass of water, the cool liquid soothing his parched throat, but it did nothing to ease the knot of tension in his chest. The events of the past few days felt surreal, as if they were part of a nightmare he had yet to wake from, and yet it was real. All of it. He thought back to the village, to the elders and their warnings, to the dark ritual that had claimed Richard's soul. There was so much he didn't understand, so many questions left unanswered. Why had the village elders kept this secret for so long? How many others had fallen victim to the same curse? And what other dark forces lurked in the shadows waiting to be unleashed? James wasn't sure he wanted to know the answers. But at the same time, he felt a pull and insatiable need to uncover the truth, to understand the otherworldly forces that had nearly destroyed them. He had seen the darkness firsthand, felt its power, and it terrified him. But it also fascinated him. The supernatural was no longer a myth or a story told to scare children. It was real, and it was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. A sudden creak of the floorboards behind him pulled him from his thoughts. Mark had entered the kitchen, his face still etched with grief but with a new resolve in his eyes. "We need to go back," Mark said quietly, his voice steady despite the pain he clearly felt. James raised an eyebrow. "Back to the village? Are you serious?" Mark nodded, his jaw clenched. "I can't just leave it like this, James. There's more going on than we realize. That place is a curse, and it's still out there waiting to claim someone else." James sighed, setting his glass down on the counter. "Mark, we barely made it out alive. What are you hoping to find? Another spirit to fight? More death? We did what we could. We saved your aunt. We stopped the spirit." "We stopped that spirit," Mark corrected. "But what about the others? What about the curse? We know the village has been hiding something for generations. My dad wasn't the first, and he won't be the last. I can't just walk away." James hesitated, torn between the instinct to walk away and the unshakable pull to dig deeper. He wanted to forget, to leave this nightmare behind and pretend it never happened. But he couldn't. The supernatural had shown itself to him, and once seen, it could not be unseen. The world was not what he thought it was, and perhaps it never had been. Mark looked at him, eyes pleading. "We have to know, James. We have to find out the truth. For my dad, for everyone." James rubbed his temples, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Finally, he nodded. "All right, we'll go back. But we need to be careful. If there's more out there, we're going to need all the help we can get." Relief washed over Mark's face, and for the first time in days, there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. They spent the next few hours tending to Aunt Lila, making sure she was stable enough to be left alone for a few days. She was still weak, but the curse had been lifted, and her health was slowly improving. Before they left, Mark knelt by her side, gently holding her hand. "I'll be back soon," he whispered. "I promise." She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes said it all. She had already lost her husband. She couldn't bear to lose her nephew too. James and Mark packed what little they had brought with them and prepared to return to the village. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with dangers they couldn't possibly predict. But they knew one thing for sure: they couldn't turn back now. The drive back to the village was eerily quiet. The once oppressive atmosphere had lifted, but a sense of unease remained. The trees lining the narrow road seemed to whisper as they passed, as if the land itself was alive and watching. The village loomed ahead, shrouded in mist and mystery, its secrets still buried beneath layers of darkness. As they approached, James felt a familiar chill crawl up his spine. He knew this wasn't over. The battle had been won, but the war had only just begun. They parked the car at the edge of the village and stepped out, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. The villagers eyed them warily as they walked through the narrow streets, their faces etched with suspicion and fear. It was clear that the village elders had not told them everything, and James and Mark intended to find out why. They made their way to the elder's house, the same place where they had first learned of the ritual that had saved Aunt Lila. The door creaked open, and the elder greeted them with a somber nod. "You've come back," he said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of centuries of knowledge. "I wondered if you would." Mark stepped forward, his eyes burning with determination. "We need answers. My father's gone, but we can't just leave it like this. Tell us the truth. Tell us everything." The elder sighed deeply, motioning for them to sit. "There is much you don't understand. The curse. It is not just on this village. It is on the land itself. The spirits you faced are but one piece of a far greater darkness, and once you have seen it, there is no escaping it." James felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced at Mark, who sat rigid in his chair, his fist clenched. This was what they had feared, what they had always known, deep down. The fight was far from over. "You faced the darkness once," the elder continued, his voice low. "But now that you've stepped into its world, it will follow you. The spirits are restless, and they will not stop until they have claimed what was taken from them." The room fell silent, the weight of the elder's words hanging in the air like a curse. James swallowed hard, the enormity of what they had just heard settling into his bones. This was no longer about saving Aunt Lila or even avenging Richard. This was about survival. Their survival. Mark looked at him, his eyes filled with both fear and resolve. "We've come this far, James. We can't turn back now," James nodded, though every instinct in his body screamed for him to run. But there was no running from this, not anymore. As they left the elder's house and stepped back into the mist-shrouded village, James knew one thing for certain: they were no longer just fighting for their lives. They were fighting against forces far older, far darker, and far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. The battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning, and this time they might not survive.